To stretch the president's foreign relations power so far as to authorize the secret use of armed force against foreign states without congressional authorization, or at least, quote, advise and consent, end quote, appears to go well beyond the proper scope of the executive's power in foreign affairs under the Constitution. Moreover, where Congress is not informed prior to the initiation of such armed covert action, as it was not, for example, in the Bay of Pigs operation, the constitutional system of checks and balances can be frustrated. Without prior notice, there can be no effective check on the action of the executive branch. Once covert actions involving armed force, such as the the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs or paramilitary operations are begun, it may be difficult, if not impossible, for practical reasons to stop them. In such circumstances, covert action involving armed intervention in the affairs of foreign states may be inconsistent with our constitutional system and its principle of checks and balances. C. The constitutional power of Congress to regulate the conduct of foreign intelligence activity. Prior to the 1947 National Security Act, Congress did not seek to expressly authorize or regulate foreign intelligence activity by statute. Congress's decision not to act, however, did not reduce or eliminate its constitutional power to do so in the future. The necessary and proper clause and its power to, quote, make rules for the government and regulation, end quote, of the armed forces, along with Congress's general powers in the fields of foreign affairs and national defense, were always available. In this light, the question of the legal authority for the conduct of foreign intelligence activity in the absence of express statutory authorization can be viewed in the manner set forth by Justice Jackson in the Steele seizure case. He wrote, "When the President acts in absence of either a congressional grant or denial of authority, he can only rely upon his own independent powers. But there is a zone of twilight in which he and Congress may have concurrent authority, or in which its distribution is uncertain. Therefore, congressional inertia, indifference, or quiescence may sometimes, at least as practical matter, enable, if not invite, measures on independent presidential responsibility." Footnote 36. Reading footnote 36. Youngstown Co. versus Sawyer, 343 U.S. 579, 637, 1952. Concurring opinion. Resuming the reading. Foreign intelligence activity, particularly political covert action not involving the use of force, can be seen as lying in such a, quote, zone of twilight, end quote, in which both the President and the Congress have concurrent authority and responsibilities. As discussed above, the use of covert, end of page 45, beginning page 46, action involving armed force raises serious constitutional problems where it is not authorized by statute, particularly if Congress is not informed. When Congress does not act, the President may, in certain circumstances, exercise authority on the basis of his own constitutional powers. Congress can, however, choose to exercise its legislative authority to regulate the exercise of that authority. In view of the President's own constitutional powers, Congress may not deprive the President of the function of foreign intelligence, but, as Chief Justice Marshall stated, Congress can, quote, prescribe the mode, end quote, by which the President carries out that function, and the Congress may apply certain limits or controls upon the President's discretion. The Supreme Court has affirmed this constitutional power of Congress of Congress. In Little versus Barim, footnote 37, Chief Justice Marshall, speaking for the court, found the seizure by the U.S. Navy of a ship departing a French port to be unlawful, even though the Navy acted pursuant to presidential order. We'll pause the reading and read footnote 37. 2 Cranch 170, 1805. Resuming the reading. By prior statute, Congress had authorized the seizure of ships by the Navy, but limited the types of seizures that could be made. The President's orders to the Navy disregarded the limits set out in the law. If Congress had been silent, Chief Justice Marshall stated, the President's authority as Commander-in-Chief might have been sufficient to permit the seizure. But Marshall declared, once Congress had, quote, prescribed the manner in which this law shall be carried into execution, end quote, the President was bound to respect the limitations imposed by Congress. Footnote 38. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 38. 2 Cranch 170, 178, 1805. Resuming the reading. There have been at least as many conceptions of the range of the President's own power as there have been holders of the office of the President. In the case of foreign intelligence activity, Justice Jackson's statement that, quote, comprehensive and undefined presidential powers hold both practical advantages and grave dangers for the country, end quote. Footnote 39, is particularly relevant, especially in view of the tension between the need for secrecy and the constitutional principle of checks and balances. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 39. Youngstown Co. versus Sawyer, 343, U.S. 579, 634. 1952, concurring opinion. Resuming the reading. Yet, as Justice Brandeis declared, quote, checks and balances were established in order that this should be a government of laws and not of men, end quote. Footnote 40. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 40. Myers versus United States, 272, U.S. 52, 292, 1926, dissenting opinion. Resuming the reading. The 1947 National Security Act represented the exercise of Congress's constitutional power to order the conduct of foreign intelligence activity under the law. By placing the authority for foreign intelligence activity on a statutory basis, Congress sought to reduce the reliance on, quote, comprehensive and undefined, end quote, presidential power that had previously been the principal source of authority. However, the language of the 1947 Act did not expressly authorize the conduct of covert action, and, as discussed earlier, Congress apparently did not intend to grant such authority. As a result, inherent presidential power has continued to serve as the principal source of authority for covert action. Congress continued to exercise this constitutional power in subsequent legislation. In the Central Intelligence Act of 1949, footnote 41, pausing the reading footnote 41, 50 U.S.C. 403A-403J. Resuming the reading. Congress, end of page 46, beginning page 47, set out the administrative procedures governing CIA activities. The 1949 Act regulated the CIA's acquisition of material, the hiring of personnel, and its accounting for funds expended. In 1947, Congress imposed a reporting requirement for the conduct of certain foreign intelligence activities. In an amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act, footnote 42, Congress provided that no funds may be expended by or on behalf of the CIA for operations abroad, quote, other than activities intended solely for obtaining necessary intelligence, end quote, unless two conditions were met. A. The President must make a finding that, quote, each such operation is important to the national security of the United States, end quote, and B. The President must report, quote, in a timely fashion, end quote, a description of such operation and its scope to congressional committees, footnote 43. Pausing the reading footnotes 42 and 43. Footnote 42. 22 U.S.C. 2422. Footnote 43. IBID. Resuming the reading. In short, the Constitution provides for a system of checks and balances, an interdependent power as between the Congress and the executive branch with respect to foreign intelligence activity. Congress, with its responsibility for the purse as the holder of legislative power, has the constitutional authority to regulate the conduct of foreign intelligence activity. End of page 47. Beginning page 48. 4. The President's Office. Intelligence has been the province of the President. It has informed his decisions and furthered his purposes. Intelligence information has been seen as largely belonging to the President, as being his to classify or declassify, his to withhold or share. The instruments of U.S. intelligence have been the President's to use and sometimes to abuse. The President is the only elected official in the chain of command over the United States' intelligence community. It is to him the Constitution and the Congress have granted authority to carry out intelligence activities. It is the President who is ultimately accountable to the Congress and the American people. The committee focused its investigation on the instruments available to the President to control, direct, and supervise the U.S. intelligence community. As the result of controversy as to whether the intelligence community has been, quote, out of control, end quote, Senate Resolution 21 directed the committee to determine the, quote, nature and extent of executive branch oversight of all United States intelligence activities, end quote. This involves three presidential instrumentalities. Footnote 1. The National Security Council, the Office of Management and Budget, the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. I will pause the reading and read footnote 1. A fourth instrumentality has been established as a result of President Ford's February 17, 1976 reorganization of the foreign intelligence community. Executive Order 11905 created the Intelligence Oversight Board. Resuming the reading. The committee sought to establish whether these mechanisms, as they have evolved, provided effective control over the entire range of U.S. intelligence activities. Particular attention was given to the subject of covert action, in part because it has been a major object of presidential review. In addition, the committee considered the adequacy of high-level supervision of espionage, counterintelligence, and the overall management of the U.S. intelligence community. For the first time in the history of congressional oversight, the committee had access to records of the proceedings of the National Security Council and its subcommittees. It reviewed the NSC directives related to intelligence and the files of other agencies' participation in the NSC's intelligence-related activities. The committee conducted extensive interviews with current and former White House, NSC, and cabinet-level officials dealing with intelligence matters. It took sworn testimony on these issues from a number of them, including the President, Secretary of State, officials of the Office of Management and Budget, and former members and staff of the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board were also interviewed. This report presents the results of that investigation and the committee's findings with respect to the central question of presidential accountability and control of the foreign intelligence activities of the United States government. End of page 48. Beginning of page 49. A. The National Security Council. 1. Overview. The National Security Council was created by the National Security Act of 1947. According to the Act, the NSC is, quote, to advise the President with respect to the integration of domestic, foreign, and military policies relating to national security, end quote, and, quote, assess and appraise the objectives, commitments, and risks of the United States in relation to our actual and potential military power, end quote. Over the years, the principal functions of the NSC have been in the field of policy formulation and the coordination and monitoring of overseas operations. Among its responsibilities, the NSC has provided policy guidance and direction for the United States intelligence activities. The National Security Council is an extremely flexible instrument. It has only 4 statutory members: the President, the Vice President, and the Secretaries of State and Defense. At the discretion of the President, others may be added to the list of attendees. NSC subcommittees may be created or abolished, and the NSC staff given great power or allowed to wither. Thus, the operation of the NSC has reflected the personal style of each president. The Council's role and responsibilities have varied according to personalities, changing policies, and special circumstances. Presidents Truman, Kennedy, and Johnson found a loose and informal NSC structure to their liking. Others have set up more formal and elaborate structures. President Eisenhower's NSC system is the best example. Footnote 2. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 2. For a full treatment of the evolution of the National Security Council and its place within the national security decision-making process, see Keith Clark and Lawrence Leaker. The President and the Management of National Security, 1969. Stanley Falk and Theodore Bauer. National Security Management, the National Security Structure, 1972, and Inquiries of the Subcommittee on National Policy Machinery for the Senate Committee on Government Operations, Organizing for National Security, 1961. Resuming the reading. At times, particularly during crises, presidents have set up, during crisis, presidents have bypassed the formal NSC mechanisms. President Kennedy set up an executive committee, EXCOM, to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Johnson had his Tuesday lunch group to discuss Vietnam and other high-level concerns. As a result, over the years, the NSC has undergone major changes, from the elaborate planning board / operations coordination board structure under Eisenhower to its dismantlement by Kennedy, and the creation of a centralized system of the NSC subcommittees under President Nixon and his assistant for national security affairs, Dr. Kissinger. Today, in addition to the 4 statutory members, the National Security Council is attended by the Director of Central Intelligence, DCI, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as advisors. From time to time, others such as the Director of Arms Control and Disarmament Agency also attend. Prior to President Ford's reorganization, the NSC was served by 7 principal committees: the Senior Review Group, the Undersecretaries Committee, the Verification Panel, the Washington Special Actions Group, WSAG, the Defense Program Review Committee, the 40 Committee, and the National Security Council Intelligence. End of page 49, beginning page 50. Committee, NSCIC, footnote 3. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 3. The senior review group, under the directive of the President's Assistant for National Security Affairs, defines NSC issues, determines whether alternatives, costs, and consequences have been fully considered, and forwards recommendations to the full council and or the president. The undersecretary's committee seeks to ensure effective implementation of NSC decisions. Verification panel monitors, the verification panel monitors arms control agreements and advises on SALT and MBFR negotiations. WASG coordinates activities during times of crises, such as the Middle East and Southeast Asia. The Defense Program Review Committee, now nearly defunct, assesses the political, military, and economic implications of defense policies and programs. Resuming the reading. The latter two committees had direct intelligence responsibilities. The 40 Committee has now been replaced by the Operations Advisory Group. No successor for NSCIC has been designated. The current NSC structure is shown below. For those of you that are watching, you can see it for yourself. For those of you that may just be listening, I will describe it. There is I don't know the name for the chart specifically, but I'll just describe it. There's a box on the top. In capital letters, you have National Security Council, and there are bullet points. You have the President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then Director of Central Intelligence. And then it branches down to Assistant to Pres for National Security Affairs, for Secretary of Affairs. I'm not sure. It's abbreviations, but I'll just read it to you. ASST to Pres, PRES, for NAT''L SEC period affairs. And then to the left, you have a box that says White House Situation Room. Now, go to the far right of that same area, you have a box that says NSC Staff. Underneath this section, you have a line from the center, and it goes all the way down, passing another group of 4 boxes. But before I go down, I'm going to read the next section, going from left to right. You have Undersecretary's Committee, Department. Let me zoom in. Department or DEP SEC of State. I'm assuming that's Department Secretary of State. Next, you have ASST to Pres for NAT''L SEC affairs. Okay, so I'm assuming it's Department Secretary of Defense, and on top was Secretary of State, Chairman JCS, and then you have DCI. Next one, you have Senior Review Group. You have the same thing. One moment, let me just look this up. assuming that's Assistant to President for National Security Affairs. If I'm wrong, my mistake. So this is part of the Senior Review Group. Then you got Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman JCS, and then DCI. Third group, you have Committee on Foreign Intelligence, DCI, and then you have abbreviation, looks like CHMN. Assistant to President for National Security Affairs, Department Secretary of Defense, Intelligence. Fourth one, my apologies for mistakes and skipping over a little bit. Verification Panel, Assistant to President for National Security Affairs, possibly CHMN, or maybe that's Chairman. Department Secretary of State, Department Secretary of Defense, Chairman JCS, Director ACDA, and then DCI. Okay, the fourth section, the bottom section with the three boxes, now it's left to right. I will read these left to right, excuse me. First one, Defense Program Review Committee, Assistant to President for National Security Affairs, Department Secretary of State, Department Secretary of Defense, Chairman JCS, Chairman Council of ECON Advisors, Director OMB DCI. Next group, Washington Special Actions Group, Assistant to President for National Security Affairs, Department Secretary of State, Department Secretary of Defense, Chairman JCS DCI. One moment. DCI, Chairman JCS, Attorney General Observer, Director OMB Observer. Okay, so now resuming the reading. Each of the current NSC subcommittees are, quote, consumers, end quote, of the intelligence community product. The DCI sits on all of them. In most cases, the DCI briefs the subcommittees and the full NSC before the agenda items are considered. The CIA representatives sit on working and ad hoc groups of the various subcommittees. The CIA's area division chiefs are the agency's representatives on the NSC interdepartmental groups, IGS, or no, just IG and then lowercase s. Footnote 4. I'm going to pause the reading and read footnote 4. NSC interdepartmental groups, IGS, are made up of representatives from state, defense, CIA, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the National Security Council. IGS are chaired by the state representative, an assistant secretary, and they prepare working papers for the senior review group. Resuming the reading. In all of these meetings, there is a constant give and take. Policymakers are briefed on current intelligence, and they, in turn, levy intelligence priorities on the CIA's representatives. End of page 50, beginning page 51. 2. The NSC and intelligence. The 1947 National Security Act established the CIA as well as the NSC. The act provided that the CIA was, quote, established under the National Security Council, end quote. and was to carry out its prescribed functions, quote, under the direction of the National Security Council, end quote. 5 broad functions were assigned to the CIA. 1. To advise the National Security Council in matters concerning such intelligence activities of the government, departments, and agencies as related to National Security Council. 2. To make recommendations to the National Security Council for the coordination of such intelligence activities of the departments and agencies of the government as relate to the national security. 3. To correlate and evaluate intelligence relating to the national security and provide for the appropriate dissemination of such intelligence within the government using, where appropriate, existing agencies and facilities. 4. To perform for the benefit of the existing intelligence agencies such additional services of common concern as the National Security Council determines can be more efficiently accomplished centrally. 5. To perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council may from time to time direct. The Director of Central Intelligence is responsible for seeing that these functions are performed and is to serve as the President's principal foreign intelligence officer. The NSC sets overall policy for the intelligence community. It does not, however, involve itself in day-to-day management activities. The task of coordinating intelligence community activities has been delegated to the DCI, who, until President Ford's reorganization, sought to accomplish it through the United States Intelligence Board, USIB. USIB was served by 15 interagency committees and a variety of ad hoc groups. It provided guidance to the intelligence community on requirements and priorities, coordinated community activities, and issued through the DCI National Intelligence Estimates, NIES. The DCI was also assisted by the Intelligence Resources Advisory Committee, IRAC. IRAC assisted the DCI in the preparation of a consolidated intelligence budget and sought to assure that intelligence resources were being used efficiently. As a result of President Ford's executive order, management of the intelligence community will now be vested in the Committee on Foreign Intelligence, CFI. United States Intelligence Board and Intelligence Resources Advisory Committee are abolished. Membership on the new committee will include the Director of Central Intelligence as chairman, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, and the Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs. Staff support will be provided by the Director of Central Intelligence's Intelligence Community, IC, staff. The new committee will report directly to the National Security Council. The Committee on Foreign Intelligence will have far-ranging responsibilities. It will oversee the budget and resources as well as establish management policies for the CIA, the National Security Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency. End of page 51, beginning page 52. And United States reconnaissance programs. Further, it will establish policy priorities for the collection and production of national intelligence. The Director of Central Intelligence will be responsible for producing national intelligence, including NIEs. To assist him in this task, the Director of Central Intelligence will set up whatever boards and committees, similar to the now U.S. Intelligence Board, to the now defunct USIB, are necessary. The President's executive order also directed the National Security Council to review on a semi-annual basis certain foreign intelligence activities prepared by the President's Assistant for National Security Affairs. These reviews will focus on the quality, scope, and timeliness of the intelligence product, the responsiveness of the intelligence community to policymakers' needs, the allocation of intelligence collection resources, and the continued appropriateness of ongoing covert operations and sensitive intelligence collection missions. One of the functions the National Security Council has assigned to the CIA is the conduct of foreign covert operations. These operations began in 1948 and have continued to the present uninterrupted. Authority to conduct covert operations has usually been ascribed to the, quote, such other functions and duties, end quote, provision of the 1947 Act, footnote 5. I will pause the reading and read footnote 5. 3 possible legal bases for covert operations are most often cited. The National Security Act of 1947, the, quote, inherent powers, end quote, of the President in foreign affairs and as Commander-in-Chief, and the Foreign Assistance Act of 1947. Congressional acquiescence and ratification through the appropriations process is a 4th possibility. See Appendix 1 of this report for a full discussion. Resuming the reading. The National Security Council uses National Security Council Intelligence Directives, NSCIDS, to set policy for the CIA and the intelligence community. National Security Council Intelligence Directives are broad delegations of responsibility issued under the authority of the 1947 Act. Footnote 6. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 6. For example, NSCIDS are used to spell out the duties and responsibilities of the Director of Central Intelligence, the coordination of covert intelligence collection activities, and the production and dissemination of the intelligence community product. Resuming the reading. They may assign duties not explicitly stated in the 1947 Act to the CIA and other intelligence departments or agencies. National Security Council Intelligence Directives, sometimes referred to by critics as the intelligence community's, quote, secret charter, end quote, are the executive directives and, therefore, not subject to congressional review. Until recently, Congress has not seen the various National Security Council intelligence directives issued by the National Security Council. 3. Overview. 40 Committee and National Security Council. NSCIC. I forgot what that acronym stands for. Continuing anyway. Prior to President Ford's reorganization, 2 National Security Council committees, the 40 Committee and the National Security Council Intelligence Committee, had special intelligence duties. Their functions and responsibilities will be discussed in turn. Throughout its history, the 40 Committee and its direct predecessors, the 303 Committee, the 5412 or Special Group, the 10/5 and 10/2 panels, have been charged by various National Security Council directives with exercising political control over foreign covert operations. Footnote 7. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 7. Covert operations encompass a wide range of programs. These include political and propaganda programs designed to influence or support foreign political parties, groups, and special political and military leaders. Economic action programs, paramilitary operations, and some counterinsurgency programs. Human intelligence collection or spying and counterespionage programs are not included under the rubric of covert operations. Resuming the reading. Now this task will be the responsibility of the Operations Advisory Group. The committees have considered the objectives of any proposed activity. End of page 52, beginning page 53. Whether the activity would accomplish those aims, how likely it would be to succeed, and in general, whether the activity would be in the American interest. In addition, the committees have attempted to ensure that covert operations were framed in such a way that they later could be, quote, disavowed, end quote, or, quote, plausibly denied, end quote, by the United States government. President Ford's executive order included the concept of, quote, plausible denial, end quote. Using the euphemism, quote, special activities, end quote, to describe covert operations, the order stated. Special activities in support of national foreign policy objectives are those activities. Are those was in brackets. Designed to further official United States programs and policies abroad which are planned and executed so that the role of the United States government is not apparent or publicly acknowledged. Footnote 7a. Pausing the reading. Reading footnote 7a. Executive Order Number 11905, February 1876. Resuming the reading. The concept of, quote, plausible denial, end quote, is intended not only to hide the hand of the United States government, but to protect the president from the embarrassment of a, quote, blown, end quote, covert operation. In the words of former CIA Director Richard Helms, in brackets, the, end brackets, special group was the mechanism set up to use as a circuit breaker so that these things did not explode in the president's face, and so that he was not held responsible for them. Footnote 7b. Pausing the reading. Reading footnote 7b. Richard Helms' testimony, June 13, 75, pages 28 through 29. Resuming the reading. In the past, it appears that one means of protecting the president from embarrassment was not to tell him about certain covert operations, at least formally. According to Bromley Smith, an official who served on the National Security Council staff from 1958 to 1969, the concept of, quote, plausible denial, end quote, was taken in an almost literal sense. Quote, the government was authorized to do certain things that the president was not advised of, end quote. Footnote 7c. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 7c. Staff summary of Bromley Smith interview, May 5th, 75. Resuming the reading. According to Secretary of State Kissinger, however, this practice was not followed during the Nixon administration, and he doubted it ever was. In exchange with a member of the House Select Committee on Intelligence, Secretary Kissinger stated, Mr. Caston, Mr. Secretary, you said that the President personally directed approval all of the covert operations during that period of time, 1972 to 1974. And in your knowledge, during all periods of time, is that correct? Secretary Kissinger, I can say with certainty during the period of time that I have been in Washington and to my almost certain knowledge at every period of time, yes. Footnote 8. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 8. Henry Kissinger testimony. House Select Committee on Intelligence. Hearings, October 31st, 75, page 3341. Resuming the reading. 4 senior officials who deal almost exclusively with foreign affairs have been central to each of the sequence of committees charged with considering covert operations. The President's Assistant for National Security Affairs, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, formerly the Deputy Undersecretary, and the Director of Central Intelligence. These 4 officials, plus the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, made up the 40, end of page 53, beginning of page 54, committee. At certain times, the Attorney General also sat on the committee. President Ford's reorganization will significantly alter this membership. The new Operations Advisory Group will consist of the President's Assistant for National Security Affairs, the Secretaries of State and Defense, the Chairman of the JCS, and the Director of Central Intelligence. The Attorney General and the Director of OMB will attend meetings as observers. The Chairman of the group will be designated by the President. Staff support will be provided by the National Security Council staff. The formal composition of the operations group breaks with tradition. The Secretaries of State and Defense will now be part of the approval process for covert operations, rather than the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and Deputy Secretary of Defense. The Operations Advisory Group appears to be, therefore, an upgraded 40 committee. Whether this proves to be the case remains to be seen. President Ford's executive order contained a provision, Section 3C3, which allows group members to send a, quote, designated representative, end quote, to meetings in, quote, unusual circumstances, end quote. The National Security Council Intelligence Committee, NSCIC, was established in November 1971 as part of a far-reaching reorganization of the intelligence community ordered by President Nixon. Footnote 9. Pausing the reading footnote 9. For over a year, the intelligence community has been under study by the Office of Management and Budget, then headed by James Schlesinger. In addition to National Security Council Intelligence Committee, the President's reorganization included an enhanced leadership role for the Director of Central Intelligence, the establishment of a net assessment group within the National Security Council staff, the creation of an Intelligence Resource Advisory Committee, IRAC, and a reconstitution of the United States Intelligence Board, USIB. The Net Assessment Group was headed by a senior National Security Council staff member and was responsible for reviewing and evaluating all intelligence products and for producing net assessments. When James Schlesinger was named Secretary of Defense in June 1973, the National Security Council Net Assessment Group was abolished. Its staff member joined Schlesinger at the Defense Department and set up a similar office. Resuming the reading. The presidential directive stated, the committee will give direction and guidance on national intelligence needs and provide for a continuing evaluation of intelligence products from the viewpoint of the intelligence user. One reason cited for creating National Security Council Intelligence Committee was a desire to make the intelligence community more responsive to the needs of policymakers. According to a news report at the time, quote, the President and Henry, brackets Kissinger, and brackets, have felt that the intelligence we were collecting wasn't always responsive to their needs, end quote, said one source. Quote, they suspected that one reason was because the intelligence community had no way of knowing day to day what the President and Kissinger needed. This is a new link between producers and consumers. We'll have to wait and see if it works, end quote. Footnote 10. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 10. Quote, Helms told to cut global expenses, end quote. New York Times, November 7th, 71, page 55. Resuming the reading. Prior to National Security Council Intelligence Committee, no formal structure existed for addressing the major questions concerning intelligence priorities rather than specific operations. Do, quote, producers, end quote, in the intelligence community perform analyses which are useful to, quote, consumers, end quote, the policy makers at various levels of government? Our intelligence resources are located wisely. End of page 54, beginning page 55. Among intelligence agencies and types of collection, National Security Council Intelligence Committee was a structural response to these issues, as well as part of the general tendency at that time to centralize a greater measure of control in the White House for national security affairs. National Security Council Intelligence Committee's mission was to give direction and policy guidance to the intelligence community. It was not, and was not intended to be, a channel for transmitting substantive intelligence from the intelligence community to policymakers, nor for levying specific requirements in the opposite direction. Neither was National Security Council Intelligence Committee involved in the process of allocating intelligence resources. Its membership included the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, who chaired the committee, the Director of Central Intelligence, the Deputy Secretaries of State and Defense, the Chairman of the JCS, and the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Monetary Affairs. National Security Council Intelligence Committee was abolished by Executive Order 11905. No successor body was created. The task of providing policy guidance and direction to the intelligence community now falls to the Committee on Foreign Intelligence. According to the President's executive order, the CFI will, quote, establish policy priorities for the collection and production of national intelligence, end quote. In addition to, the full National Security Council is now required to conduct policy reviews twice a year on the quality, scope, and timeliness of intelligence and on the responsiveness of the intelligence community and the needs of policymakers. B. Authorization and control of covert activities. 1. The National Security Council and covert activities. History. President Ford's Operations Advisory Group is the most recent in a long line of executive committees set up to oversee CIA activities. These committees and CIA covert activities can be traced back to National Security Council 4A, a National Security Council directive issued in December 1947. In 1947, the United States was engaged in a new struggle, the Cold War. To resist communist-backed civil war in Greece, the Truman Doctrine was proclaimed. The Marshall Plan was about to begin. Within 3 years, China would, quote, fall, end quote. The Korean War would begin, and the Soviet Union would require an atomic capability. The Cold War was being fought on two fronts, one overt, the other covert. The Soviet clandestine services, then known as NKVD, now the KGB, were engaged in espionage and subversive activities throughout the world. France and Italy were beleaguered by a wave of communist-inspired strikes. In February 1948, the communists staged a successful coup in Czechoslovakia. The Philippines government was under attack by the Hukbalahaps, a communist-led guerrilla group. In that climate, and in response to it, a broad range of United States covert activities were begun. They were intended to supplement, not replace, overt U.S. activities, such as the Marshall Plan. In December 1947, the Department of State advised the National Security Council that covert operations mounted by the Soviet Union threatened the defeat of American objectives and recommended that the United States supplement its own overt policy activities with covert operations. At the Council's first meeting on December 19, 1947, it approved NSC-4, entitled, quote, Coordination of Foreign Intelligence. End of page 55, beginning page 56. Information measures, end quote. This directive empowered the Secretary of State to coordinate, to coordinate overseas information activities designed to counter communism. A top secret annex to NSC-4, NSC-4-A, instructed the Director of Central Intelligence to undertake covert psychological activities in pursuit of the aims set forth in NSC-4. The initial authority given the CIA for covert operations under NSC-4-A did not establish formal procedures for either coordinating or approving these operations. It simply directed the DCI to undertake covert action and to ensure, through liaison with state and defense, that the resulting operations were consistent with American policy. In 1948, an independent CIA office, the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, was established to carry out the covert mission assigned by the National Security Council. NSC-4-A was the President's first formal authorization for covert operations in post-war period, footnote 11, and it was used to undertake covert attempts to influence the outcome of the 1948 Italian national elections. Pausing the reading footnote 11. Covert operations were carried out by the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, during the Second World War. OSS was disbanded on October 1st, 1945. 3 months later, on January 22nd, 1946, President Truman issued an executive order creating the Central Intelligence Group, CIG. CIG was the direct predecessor of the CIA. It operated under an executive council. The National Intelligence Agency, NIA. Although a psychological warfare capability existed within CIG, it did not engage in any covert operations during its existence. CIG and NIA were dissolved with the passage of the 1947 National Security Act. Resuming the reading. Over the next 7 years, from June 1948 to March 1955, from March to March 1955, a series of National Security Council directives were issued. Each was addressed in part to the review and control of the CIA covert activities. NSC 10/2 superseded NSC 4 -4-A on June 18, 1948, and a quote 10/2 panel, end quote, the first predecessor of today's Operations Advisory Group, was established. The panel was to review, but not approve, covert action proposals. The 1948 directive was superseded by National Security Council 10/5 on October 23, 1951. This directive authorized an expansion of worldwide covert operations, footnote 12, and altered policy coordination procedures, footnote 13. Reading footnote 12. Prior to this time, CIA covert operations were largely confined to psychological warfare, and almost all were media related. These activities included the use of false publications, quote, black, end quote, radio, and subsidies to publications. With the issuance of National Security Council 10/2, 3 other categories of covert activity were added to the psychological warfare mission: political warfare, economic warfare, and preventative direct action, e.g., in parentheses, e.g., support for guerrillas, sabotage, and front organizations, end parentheses. Reading footnote 13. At this same time, the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, was merged with the CIA's Office of Special Operations, which was responsible for espionage. The CIA's clandestine service was now in place. Resuming the reading. Throughout this period, National Security Council directives provided for consultation with representatives of state and defense, but these representatives had no approval function. There was no formal procedure committee to consider and approve projects, nor was a representative of the president consulted. From 1949 to 1952, the Director of Central Intelligence approved CIA covert action projects on his own authority. Footnote 14. Pausing the reading, reading footnote 14. The Director of Central Intelligence did, however, undertake external coordination of covert action programs. Under National Security Council 10/2, the Executive Coordination Group, the 10/2 panel, met regularly with the CIA's Assistant Director for Policy Coordination to plan and review covert action programs. This procedure continued under the 10/5 panel. Resuming the reading. From 1953 to March 1955, the Director of Central Intelligence coordinated project approvals with the psychological, end of page 56, beginning page 57, Strategy Board, or the Operations Coordination Board, footnote 15. Pausing the reading and reading footnote 15. The Psychological Strategy Board, PSB, a National Security Council subcommittee, established April 4th, 1951, was charged with determining the, quote, desirability and feasibility, end quote, of proposed covert programs and major covert projects. A new and expanded, quote, 10/5 panel, end quote, was established comprising the members from the earlier 10/2 panel. But adding staff representation of the PSB. The 10/5 panel functioned much as the 10/2 panel had. But the resulting procedure proved cumbersome and potentially insecure. Accordingly, when the Psychological Strategy Board was replaced by the Operations Coordinating Board, OCB, on September 2nd, 1953, coordination of covert operations reverted to a smaller group identical to the former 10/2 panel, without Operations Coordinating Board staff participation. In March 1954, National Security Council 5412 was issued, or NSC. It required the Director of Central Intelligence to consult with the Operations Coordinating Board. Resuming the reading. Certain covert activities were brought to the President's attention at the Director of Central Intelligence's initiative. By the mid-1950s, covert operations were no longer an ad hoc response to specific threats. They had become an institutional part of the, quote, protracted conflict, end quote, with the Soviet Union and communism. In September 1954, a top-secret report on CIA covert activities prepared in connection with the Second Hoover Commission was submitted to President Eisenhower. The introduction to that report is enlightening for what it said about how covert operations were viewed at that time, as well as the rationale for them. As long as it remains national policy, another important requirement is an aggressive covert psychological, political, and paramilitary organization, more effective, more unique, and if necessary, more ruthless than that employed by the enemy. No one should be permitted to stand in the way of the prompt, efficient, and secure accomplishment of this mission. It is now clear that we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever means and at whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply. If the U.S. is to survive, long-standing American concepts of, quote, fair play, end quote, must be reconsidered. We must develop effective espionage and counter-espionage services and must learn to subvert, sabotage, and destroy our enemies by more clever, more sophisticated, and more effective methods than those used against us. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. Two significant National Security Council directives on covert activities were issued in 1955. The first, NSC 5412/1, made the Planning and Coordination Group, PCG, an OCB committee, the normal channel for policy approval of covert operations. Footnote 16. Reading footnote 16. NSC 5412/1 was issued March 12, 1955. That same month, the Director of Central Intelligence briefed the PCG on all CIA covert operations previously approved under NSC-4-A, 10/2, 10/5, and 5412. Excuse me. Excuse me. Resuming the reading. Approval by an executive committee was now the rule. The second National Security Council directive was issued later in 1955 and remained in force until NSDM 40, which created the 40 Committee, was issued in February 1970. Because of the significance of this second directive, it covered policy objectives as well as approval and control procedures, and the fact that it stood as U.S. policy for 15 years, it deserves detailed consideration. The directive reiterated previous National Security Council statements that the overt, end of page 57, beginning page 58, foreign activities of the U.S. government should be supplemented by covert operations, end quote. It stated in part that the CIA was authorized to create and exploit problems for international communism, discredit international communism and reduce the strength of its parties and organization, reduce international communist control over any areas of the world, strengthen the orientation toward the United States of the nations of the free world, accentuate, wherever possible, the identity of interest between such nations and the United States, as well as favoring, where appropriate, those groups genuinely advocating or believing in the advancement of such mutual interests, and increase the capacity and will of such peoples and nations to resist international communism. In accordance with established policies and to the extent practicable in areas dominated or threatened by international communism, develop underground resistance and facilitate covert and guerrilla operations. The directive dealt with means as well as ends. Specifically, such covert action operations shall include any covert activities related to propaganda, political action, economic warfare, preventive direct action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition, escape and evasion and evacuation measures, subversion against hostile states or groups, including assistance to underground resistance movements, guerrillas, and refugee liberation groups, support of indigenous and anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world, deception plans and operations, and all compatible activities necessary to accomplish the foregoing. Control and approval procedures were significantly altered by this directive. The Operations Coordinating Board functions were transferred to, quote, designated representatives, end quote, of the Secretaries of State and Defense and the President. This was the first time a, quote, designated representative, end quote, of the President had been brought into the approval or consultative process. The special group, as this committee came to be known, was charged with reviewing and approving covert action programs initiated by the CIA. Footnote 17. Pausing the reading footnote 17. Coordination procedures were slightly modified on March 26, 1957. The Secretary of State was given sole approval authority for particularly sensitive projects that did not have military implications. Further, the CIA was now required to keep the Departments of State and Defense advised on the progress in implementing all approved covert action programs. Resuming the reading. Even under the new directive, criteria governing the submission of covert action projects to the special group were never clearly defined. As a 1967 CIA memorandum stated, the procedures to be followed in determining which CA bracket covert action and bracket operations required approval by the special. End of page 58, beginning page 59. Group or by the State Department, or by the Department of State and other arms of the U.S. government were, during the period 1955 to March 1963, somewhat cloudy and thus can probably be best described as having been based on value judgments by the Director of Central Intelligence. And I will stop here for today's recording.